Det finns många platser här framme. Eller några stycken i alla fall. Ska vi köra igång eller? Okay. Okay, I think that everyone has found a chair, so I'll like to welcome you all to this seminar on fighting homophobia in Eastern Europe. And Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation is the organizer, and I suppose that most of you know what Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation is. We founded the foundation some 25 years ago after the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall. And the aim is, of course, to promote democracy, freedom, and market economy in Europe and in the areas joint to Europe primarily. But we are active more or less all over the world. I'm Peter Egardt. I'm chairman of Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation since yesterday. So this is almost my first task as a newly elected chairman. And we have also members of the board present here, our deputy speaker, Tobias. I think I saw Diana Janse somewhere. Did I? She's out there. Well, anyhow, we are here at your disposal. And we also have elected an honorary chairman, and that is Carl Bildt. And he's not able to be here today, but he will be active, as always, with the foundation. But today we are going to discuss homophobia in Eastern Europe. And as is said in the invitation, the pogroms against LGBT people in Chechnya have been a wake-up call for advocates of human rights and international law. And yet LGBT activists in the region are under pressure from the Kremlin and like-mindeds, civilizational war against the West, portrayed as decadent and immoral. I'm quoting the invitation. And of course, we have also observed that anti-LGBT messages have been part of election campaigns in a number of countries in Eastern Europe. And meanwhile, tendencies towards a shrinking space for the civil society can also be observed in other EU member states, which of course raises a number of important questions. I won't try to answer them, but we will have a discussion about that after we've heard the introduction by Maxim Eristavi, whom we are very proud of having here. And he will present, well, the current state of the frontline struggle for freedom and tolerance in Europe's East. And Maxim is an outspoken advocate for civil rights and the only, as I believe, the only openly gay journalist in Ukraine. Eristavi is a co-founder of the independent Ukrainian news outlet Hromadske International. He is a 2015 Poynter Fellow at Yale University and a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council. And without further ado, I will give the floor to you, telling us how we should fight homophobia in Eastern Europe. Please.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming. I'm really grateful for Foundation giving me this chance to talk to a terrific room of, people who are interested in the topic or or already allies or want to be an allies. So I'm gonna, sorry, my messages pop up. um, I'm gonna be quite brief. What I actually do, do not like to talk much. I like to answer questions if you have any kind of questions. So I will go for a very brief presentation. My job here, as I see it, is to empower you as allies with right talking points when you try to explain your local audiences, either society or voters, why you should be involved in the issues with Eastern Europe and equality fight specifically. And also the second part of my job is to provide you with right background so you don't hurt our own fights back in the region with misrepresentation and wrong facts. So I actually wanted to quickly focus on just 4 topics. One topic is about the issue why we have to be involved in Eastern Europe and specifically equality fight. The second one is why it is so fascinating for us as Europeans or as a developed world to just pay attention and why it's not a local fight. The third one is lessons we are learning as we go now when it comes to civil rights in Eastern Europe that can be applicable and can be used back in the developed world. And first and fourth is just a couple of practical points, how we can actually start doing something positive right away. So I have couple of illustrative videos. I'm involved at the moment with a project that supports independent journalism in Eastern Europe. We work with 7 countries. Being a journalist in all of those countries is quite harsh, but what we trying to help, we're looking for really good stories on the ground, and we're trying to bring them to international audience as well, so people actually do not talk about the issue of civil rights equality or fight for reforms or for human rights as an abstract issue, because we're dealing with a region with tens of millions of people, and that fight is always extremely personal. It's not an abstract. So let me start with very simple point. When I travel abroad and when I try to build bridges and when I try to get more allies to care about the issue, I always say that I'm not here to ask for any additional resources. I'm not here to ask anything from you except you finishing your own fight back at home. Because what we're dealing in Eastern Europe in the last 10 years has been direct result of enormous influx of resources from international homophobic groups. The situation 10 years ago has been quite dissimilar as you had your equality fights in the developed world. It was all about customs, it was about history, about overcoming prejudices from a historic point of view. 10 years ago, it became something different. It's not enough for us anymore to just explain our people and to educate our people about why it's important to have civil rights equality. We're dealing with gigantic transborder international homophobic groups who bring intellectual resources, financial resources, copy-paste talking points to local homophobic groups, and actually make them extremely effective at targeting their audience. So basically, it works very simple. So some conservative American or European group comes to Russia or Ukraine or Georgia, and they say, you know what, maybe we don't agree on religion, but we're fighting the same enemy. Those are women and queer people. Here's our talking points we've already translated for you that worked very well back in our countries, and you can use them and actually achieve some result. So when I travel to the States, when I travel to the UK, and then I go back and home, and I hear absolutely the same messages, and they're very unified. For example, like homosexuality is a choice, that Western values make you gay, and stuff like that, that actually fascinating to see how globalization has shifted the ground for our local fight. So it's important to understand, but another important issue is that we're actually dealing not with local problems when it comes to LGBT rights and equality. Moreover, I refrain from using just terms as LGBT rights or equality fight, because what we're dealing on the ground is a complex, massive problem of a civilizational war. So LGBT issues on the ground are embedded in every aspect of geopolitical storm that is happening. So Russian onslaught on its neighbors and former colonies through military campaign is enhanced and supported by massive propaganda that has this anti-gay homophobic message as one of the foundational issues. So it's not only troops marching across the border and taking over the territory, it's also ideology that spreads through propaganda. And that ideology, unfortunately, is based primarily on homophobia. Well, I want to show you one terrific video that we did from Russia, based on Russian story. It actually shows you, it's a terrific illustration and a good talking point to show that actually fighting for equality and civil rights equality in places like Russia, Ukraine, or Georgia, it's primarily a national security issue. And it's 1 minute. Actually, I love this illustration because who would knew that the issue of LGBT rights in Caucasus in Russia has any link to ISIS and Syria and in Russian involvement in that region? These are bazillion examples like that. When it comes to very important lesson that we learned through this fight for equality rights in the region, it's intersectional in many ways. So for example, when we have crisis in Chechnya, it's not just a gay pogrom targeting gay men. It's a larger part of its horrible story of massive human rights violation in the Republic that is happening under absolutely direct cover from the Kremlin, and creates a lot of national security issues because it's so intertwined with, for example, a Chechen government accusing all dissenting voices of being automatically ISIS supporters. Then when those people try to run to Europe for their lives, Europe won't accept them because Russia blames them to be ISIS supporters. Now it becomes quickly a national security issue. With Chechen men, for example, who we try to help to get to Europe, the biggest issue was that a lot of European governments won't accept them because they were Muslim men, and because Russian security service tells them that every Muslim person who's coming from Russia applying for asylum probably involved with extremism groups. So it tells us a lot of stories that we need to learn more about human rights issues because they are very intertwined with general national security issues in the region as well. It is also an important story about places. When you look at the violations of human rights, you can always spot that they actually cross the border, sectional border, quite quickly. For example, the issue with onslaught on civil society groups, anti-corruption groups in Ukraine in recent couple of months. This is issue that it's targeting queer groups as well in civil society in general. It also erodes the justice reform. It erodes the law enforcement reform just because people get wrong messages. In Georgia, where just over the weekend, 2 prominent LGBT leaders were severely beaten by police, and those two leaders were charged for misconduct, not their attackers. This is a larger part of the larger pattern in the recent year, with collapsing space for effective law enforcement in Georgia and political elites within the country using law enforcement for their political causes. So again, when you try to raise the issue of human rights, it is so intersectional within Eastern Europe. It gives you a good talking point to embed it within every issue. And if you look closely, you can find those bridges connecting human rights and issue with national security or economy or overall progress very easily. Well, I think the last point that I want to make quickly before we go to questions is about how we can be helpful. Well, first of all, Swedish government has outsized, Swedish presence, not only government but civil society, has outsized influence in Eastern Europe. You cannot imagine how many meetings and how many doors a Swedish diplomat can open, having outsized influence and say when it comes to human rights. It is already, historically so. When you go to Georgia, Ukraine, when you go even to places more harsh like Belarus or Russia, for us as a fighters, it is extremely instrumental to have support of Swedish people. But there are also little things. Well, first of all, it's media coverage. Unless we don't get sufficient media coverage abroad about those issues. And for example, by any point, any means, the coverage of Chechen crisis is not sufficient at all. So the majority of people I know back in the States or Europe who are not in politics or civil society, they don't know that this problem even exists, despite that what is happening in Chechnya is the biggest human crime against gays in decades for the region. The second one is like smaller things. Last week, one prominent LGBT leaders from Georgia texted me that he went to Pride to Stockholm. For him, that Pride was the first Pride he ever attended, and he's in his mid-30s. It was such an emotional moment for him, and he talked about feeling liberated, feeling accepted in public, which for people here might be a bit corny or trivial thing, but for a lot of people who are fighters on everyday basis in such brutal places like Eastern Europe, it could be a much needed boost of confidence and belief and hope that they receive, and it doesn't cost anything for that kind of support. And the last point is that many people do not understand how incremental support of our foreign allies for people like me or for other fighters in the region, because you actually can get meetings for us with our own officials that we can ever possibly get on our own. You open the doors for us that we cannot open on our own. You amplify our voices because local officials do care and they do listen and what you actually can say, and they actually react much better than they react to our voices. So I always tell the story that members of European Parliament, for example, in Kiev, usually being stopped on the streets by people who recognize them. That never happens in Brussels. But because members of European Parliament have such an outsized influence as a foreign authority in places like Georgia and Ukraine, they actually help us to make things done, defend civil society, raise this issue, and all the progress that we've been able to achieve with LGBT rights in places like Ukraine, which is the biggest battleground for the region in the last 3 years, having at least 2 successful violence-free prides has been achieved because of simple things. Members of European Parliament or other parliaments marched together, shoulder to shoulder with us, forcing police to get more protection to those events, because otherwise sometimes local law enforcement doesn't care about us being heard, but they care about foreigners. I'm not saying that this is the most healthiest thing, but it helps us a lot to push things forward, and it gives us more strength. So, done with me talking much. I would really love for you to have, to answer any of your questions and be more helpful for you to just to fill out any gaps when it comes to the situation on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I open the floor for everyone else, I snatch the privilege of being chairman.
Absolutely.
And would like to ask you, you've been talking about what has happened and what it's like today. How do you see the coming years? Is it getting better or is it getting worse?
Well, I see it as the process in the making. That's why it's so hard for us to get sometimes a clear picture of what is happening in the region, because as much negative things happen as positive on every given day. So for me personally, it's always about hope, and passion to move forward. And I come from a very harsh ghetto in eastern Ukraine, so that's the only thing that got me here. This is a place where I'm standing from. But in general, I do feel encouraged, because we usually forget how much progress the whole region has achieved in the last 4 years, and how closely it was linked to the European integration. So the issue, for example, a free trade agreement that Moldova, Georgia, and Ukraine got, it seems like it's about economy or trade. It's not, because one of the incremental parts of that trade agreement was the first ever anti-discrimination law targeting LGBT people in the whole region that was embedded as conditionality to that trade agreement. So maybe elites weren't kind of happy about it, and maybe Ukrainian parliament took 9 attempts to vote that in. But at the same time, this is to the date the first ever law that mentions LGBT in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. The other issue, with law enforcement reform, the EU has been incremental in pushing reform for police in Ukraine. Seems like it's just law enforcement. No, it's LGBT issue as well, because since we got new police, we got 2 violence-free prides that were extremely good protected. So those small things, they actually matter more. But again, it's very naive to expect from the region of so many decades in authoritarian, colonial legacy to change over 1 year or 2 or 5. But I see positive developments.
Okay.
They will end and stop if we don't get help of our foreign allies.
Okay. A long way to go still, but there is hope. Okay, then I'll use my hand and just point at you, if that's okay. You're first.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Annika Ben-David. I'm Ambassador at Large for Human Rights, Democracy and the Rule of Law at the Foreign Ministry, and I'll have the pleasure of talking to you later this afternoon. But just to thank you for your kind words of appreciation for the footwork of Swedish diplomats in the region. I'm happy to hear, and I'm also happy to tell you that this year at the Pride Parade, for the 2nd consecutive year, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs was present. We were among around 70 colleagues who marched for anti-discrimination, which was a wonderful experience. One question from me. You mentioned this breakthrough law in the framework of the EU free trade agreement. Has there been any cases that have been... Has there been any precedent where a person has sued the state for discrimination as of yet? Thank you.
No, and it's it's the same situation for Georgia and Moldova. It's very simple. Why? Because you have this law which is symbolically and historically important, but practically I cannot use it, because if I'm discriminated at workplace and I go and I sue my employer, but then I go outside my office and I can be physically attacked, there is no law protecting me from that. So it makes no sense for a lot of people to speak out and fight, because there is no violence protection. There is no hate crime legislation that actually protects people in, for example, Ukraine. And we've been finding very hard to just get that on the books. So the fight is extremely basic for, for just protection against violence, for example. We're not raising issue yet about broader civil rights equality. But again, it's a good opportunity for us because we can talk in more universal terms. For example, when I'm back in the region, I never use LGBT term. For a lot of people, they don't know what it is. And for the rest who know what it is, it's so politicized. So you just drop the word LGBT, the conversation can go very wrong. So instead, I push for more bridge building stuff like, in general terms, civil rights equality, access to constitutional rights. We're talking about systems that are already in place, that already provide us queer people with equality already as it is to marriage. The majority of constitutions in Eastern Ukraine, they do not mention gender at all. So, some things are achievable within the existing framework. But one of the most illustrative examples from the last Kyiv Pride, which was the first violence-free, we got the crowd that was predominantly straight, of our straight allies, not because they cared much or knew much about LGBT issues, but because they reacted so strongly to the message that we're fighting against suppressing of our rights for freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. And people, especially after a violent Maidan revolution, people are so sensitive about it, and they said that this won't fly in Ukraine after Maidan revolution, that somebody like neo-Nazi people threatened with violence a peaceful protest. So they showed up in record numbers to support us. So this is the room of opportunity that we're talking about in Eastern Europe.
Okay, thank you. Oh, yes.
Thanks for that. It was really interesting, and it's great that you could be in Stockholm. I've been following you on Twitter for years. It's interesting
Thank
to
you so much.
hear you in the flesh.
I'm
okay,
real.
I've got a question. You said something at the beginning about how there were Western groups that were funding homophobia in Eastern Europe. You mentioned the US and the UK specifically. I wonder, first of all, are there any groups in continental Europe? Is there also funding coming from continental Europe? If so, where should we be looking for it? Sorry, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm James Savage. I'm a journalist. I work for The Local, which is an English language news organisation working around Europe. So I'm particularly interested to know if we should be looking for funding of homophobic groups in Eastern Europe, where should we be looking?
It's a terrific question. Actually, it's very easy. So what I always start with is World Family Congress. This is the biggest, probably international transborder congregation of homophobic and anti-women organizations. They do, it's a US-based group, but it's very international. They do annual conferences. This year it was in Budapest. Last year it was in Tbilisi. And if you look at the list of participants, it's just illuminating. The majority of them come from the US. The second biggest delegate group is from Russia. And there are almost any far-right or far-right religious group from Europe you can find. The places that they choose for their congresses are not accidental. So Hungary now is a big channel of support for far-right and homophobic groups. Poland as well. So sometimes it breaks down to just Googling and following the traits. Any other religious group that is, most of them are obviously American because they have much more resources and they're more involved into developing countries. And they try to, expand what I call safe havens for homophobia somewhere else because they lost some fights in the developed world and they, it's the good test grounds for them to come up with new, more effective strategies. But there are a bunch of less religious but far-right groups. So again, you just follow any other far-right groups, you can see how remarkably they all connected, they exchange experience. This is, I would love to see for LGBT groups and for queer movement, which is still not globalized. It's very local. It's based on, within the borders, when in fact our enemies are maybe years ahead in communicating, exchanging on everyday basis, having those large delegations from Russia and US mingling about how to suppress women's rights is remarkable to see. And it happens because of globalization as well. So why not, I wonder sometimes why for us not to use the same opportunities we have to create kind of a more convergence on the right side of history.
Okay. Who's next in line? Yes, please.
Hello, my name's Judith Black. I'm from the Swedish Institute here in Stockholm. I work with a funding program called Creative Force. And Creative Force gives fairly small-scale funding to partnerships between Swedish organisations, including Jarl Hjalmarson Stiftelsen, for projects in collaboration with partners in all the Eastern Partnership countries and Russia, for projects which aim to promote human rights, freedom of speech, democracy, usually using the media or culture as a medium. We traditionally, one of the conditions of granting funding through Creative Force is that we promote partnerships between organizations. So my question is, to what degree can we see that people, human rights defenders, including LGBT rights defenders, are willing to organize, to work within organizations in circumstances where there is a shrinking space for human rights? Because this is one of the aspects that we have to take into consideration. Are we missing a lot of potential if we exclude activists who are working on their own?
It's a terrific question. And in a way that the lesson that I've learned in the last 3 years, at some point I became very frustrated about the state of affairs when it comes to civil rights equality in the region. Because usual channels, political channels, or going through legislative field is not working anymore, because identity wars in the region are as severe as they are here. So every issue tied to gay rights or female rights is extremely politicized. So I was like thinking about, maybe some people are right. Maybe some progress is not achievable for next 20, 30 years. So it made me think that we should go creatively about the ways we can expand the space for equality, not within traditional channels of legislative or political. So for example, I work much more with businesses, with international businesses, with foreign investors in the region. They don't have to come out publicly, but if they have strong support for equality within their corporate cultures, they can expand that equality for their employees on the ground. Sometimes it matters much if you feel safe and open and comfort enough within your workforce. And by the way, with such a high profile foreign investors in the region, people do care what they think, and other businesses follow their example. If, for example, we ever have, and I hope next year we will, the first ever corporate presence at the Pride, it will have great effect on other businesses, manifesting their support if they're leaning towards. So this is one creative thing. Another creative thing, the whole fight for equality in Eastern Europe is extremely intersectional. So for example, if you invest as much, especially if you invest as much resources towards fight for gender equality, this is this is the issue that queer equality will not be able possibly to achieve without gender equality in the region. A region that is so, patriarchal, so dependent on macho culture. If we don't get the issue with gender equality fixed, we'll never be able to achieve any LGBT equality as well. So go creative into dimensions that are related, but not specifically LGBT. Otherwise, if you pour resources, and it's not the case just of Ukraine, if you pour resources to specific segmentation, and especially its foreign resources, those segments become very dependent on foreign support. And then we have the same kind of problems with over-reliance on foreign donors, of not being actually active as a civil society, helpful as a civil society, except just spending 80% of our time fundraising, servicing, grants, fundraising again. And I'm coming from civil society, so this is a very frank statement. But this is true, yeah.
Okay.
Have enough?
Your turn, yes. I think it's your turn. Yeah, that's right.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very inspiring speech. I was working with research from the private sector in, I think it was in Turkmenistan a couple of years ago. And due to my past, I usually always start not with the GDP part, but with Amnesty International. And I saw the country was blacklisted by Amnesty International and Doctors Without Borders.
Yeah.
But the United Nations and the World Health Organization went the opposite way. They not only went there to have official meeting, but they also gave like public awards to the regime, where also how they are on all kinds of human rights in that country.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your thoughts about when United Nations are legitimizing these kind of regimes, which I thought was appalling? I don't know if we can leverage a little bit about that.
Well, I can give you another example, which kind of says that it's not black and white. This year, the biggest foreign delegation presence at the Kyiv Pride was United Nations. In times when we have massive moral withdrawal from countries like US, from the region, who would be traditionally big defenders of civil society and reforms in the region, United Nations, some offices, step in and fill that void when it comes to supporting civil society. Now, I don't think that it's helpful even to talk about United Nations as one body. And I think regional offices matter much in terms of analyzing and actually rating by their effectiveness. So in countries like Ukraine, again, with ongoing invasion, with colossal humanitarian crisis in eastern Ukraine, where state is not present at all, United Nations and humanitarian organizations are the only one providing support for almost 4 million people who are constantly on the brink of hunger and mass humanitarian situation. So I think that's a terrific question, because it leads us to assessment of our involvement in the region and asking greater questions why we're doing that, right? So for diplomatic or human rights or civil society organizations, sometimes I feel like there is lack of focus why we are there and we're doing something apart from just our organizational goals to spend some money and do some grants. So some organizations, some offices are are better at this, some are worse, but that's why I'm here, in a way that to remind you that if you don't have a bigger picture and you don't have the answer to the question why you need to care and be involved organizationally through UN or through your government on the ground, there's probably no point of coming there at all. And there is a greater point. It's not only about security, it's not about defending borders and sovereignty and issues that are international. It's about having this part of the world, Eastern Europe, that identifies itself as Europeans, and they're coming to Europe whether you want it or not. And if you look at all the polling, there is predominant, more than 70-80% of in all those countries, support for future within European family, not the EU, European family. So they're already part of the Europe, and they already identify themselves. So sometimes they can tell you more about why they're so passionate about European values that Europeans back in Western Europe can. So for example, I don't know that if many Europeans can answer the question why Ukrainians keep dying under European flags in Ukraine. This is something that many people find puzzling here. But I know, because a lot of people see their future within European values much strongly and passionately, and they see it much clearly. And again, it's not about EU becoming a member of EU or having trade benefits. It's about values, about freedoms and transparency and more efficient government that you actually own, and you can call it your own. So as long as we're not on the same page here with our Western partners and with civil society in the Eastern Europe or in Turkmenistan, for example, things like that can happen. So they're a bit off just because probably office there does not kind of get the idea why they're in the country, what they do. So you can be helpful in many million ways without just legitimizing the regime.
Thank you. Alexandra Naikeva-Ruzin, the Macedonian ambassador to Sweden. Thank you for the very straightforward and passionate presentation. I appreciate it greatly. If you don't mind, I would like us to go back a bit to these international homophobic organizations that you said are pretty active in the region of Eastern Europe. Could you elaborate a bit more when their activities began in the region, or at least when the activities intensified? If you could further assess the situation of with the human rights and especially LGBT rights in the region prior to intensification of their efforts in the region, and if you could also assess whether their activities overshadow the efforts of the international and regional organizations that are actually fighting for the human rights and the LGBT rights in Eastern Europe. And secondly, you mentioned that there is a project to support independent journalism in Eastern Europe. Could you elaborate more which 7 countries are part of it, when this project began, where is it funded from, and whether the results are something which is satisfactory, and what you could actually suggest to improve or to enhance the effects of the project? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll start with the latter. This is the project's called Russian Language News Exchange. This is the first ever support network for independent newsrooms in Eastern Europe. It is funded by European Union and a bunch of European governments. This is a more healthy approach towards fighting propaganda and misinformation instead of creating counter-propaganda, which in fact the same kind of propaganda. So we work with the newsrooms on the ground in countries that are affected by propaganda, or in places like Azerbaijan, where the regime crushes any dissented voices. So it's Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. Basically all Eastern European partnership, not partnership, but Eastern European countries. By the fact of achieving everyday operations of that project is something already remarkable for the region. We work with partners in those 7 countries. Unfortunately, I cannot disclose all the entities because working with this project for some partners in places like Azerbaijan and Russia is threatening just to disclose that. But we help them to exchange content with each other on everyday basis because they're all small newsrooms. They struggle in the digital environment to just map themselves, and taking in a lot of the high quality content from other partners sometimes helps them to pop up in Google searches. The other important thing that we actually support more reporting through that through their newsrooms. We fund projects, we support as producers, and so on and so on. So it has been a year since the project launched, and I'm extremely excited to work on it because it's something unprecedented for the region. The point with international homophobic groups is that situation got worse where, at the same time where it got worse everywhere. So when they started losing battles in the developed world with marriage equality in the States, with majority recognition of civil rights equality for gay people and gender equality in Europe, they started looking for other bases to be successful, to pour money, and to, again, establish on the front lines safe havens for homophobia where they can test some things. And I feel like they want to come back to their home bases with re-energized with better strategies how to fight the equality off. So it started around like 10 years ago, late 2000s, early 2010, 2012. The situation in the region has never been extremely liberal in Eastern Europe, obviously because of the Soviet legacy. But at the same time, I remember that in late 90s, early 2000s, it was much more thriving space for community. So people were much more comfortable with expressing their sexual identity. There were no talks whatsoever about suppressing women's rights in any way. Now we have a bunch of anti-abortion initiatives all around the region. It all escalated quite dramatically after we achieved huge successes in Europe and the States. Now the fight became extremely global and extremely acute for them. So they need to show some alternative, as they call it, and to establish successful alternative regimes for it. So again, we're talking not only about Russia that uses the cornerstone of their civilizational war against their Europe, but governments in Hungary, in Poland, initiatives that we have, anti-abortion initiatives that we have in Ukraine, the anti-abortion law and initiatives that we have in Caucasus, something unprecedented for the region. But it's part of the global identity wars. It's just, if we don't pay attention to it much, and it's happening on our backyard, they will come back much more re-energized with more resources and with more manpower.
Hello, my name is Jon Fridholm and I work at Östgruppen, a Swedish human rights organization. I just like to know all these breakaway regions, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria, and Donbass. Do you have cooperation going on with any groups within those regions? And I guess the situation is very different and much more harsh, but I know very little. Maybe you have a few words to say about.
Well, Abkhazia last year passed the first ever anti-abortion law in Eastern Europe. I mean, it's not law officially, but this is, because the occupied territories are probably the most radical into manifesting this civilizational battle between Europe and Russia, we see the most horrible things happening there. Not only in Abkhazia that suppresses women, and there are actually reported 3 deaths from after that law related to abortion bans. But things like that are happening in Crimea and Eastern Ukraine with the gay people being tortured and killed. We had a number of instances where transgender people were killed on the checkpoints when they tried to escape Eastern Ukraine last year and a year before that. So because there's basically lowness exists there, all the minorities suffer right away and in pretty much harsh way. But they're also manifesting those extreme, absolutely insane issues, like, again, tied to human rights, but especially female freedoms and queer freedoms. The only way to work with it, I mean, there is opportunity to work and try to help people on the ground, but the only way to work through it is to reestablish the state of law in those territories. There is no reach of international organizations there. There is no jurisdiction of any courts, international courts, so people that are just trapped into nowhere land. They cannot fight for their rights. Even Russians can fight for their rights through European Court of Human Rights, and the biggest workload of cases coming from Russian Federation. But people in Karabakh or Abkhazia or South Ossetia cannot do that unless they get passports of those countries that are close to them enough.
Thank you so much, Maxim, for your candid presentation. My name is Jasmine Cameron. I work for the Justice International, small NGO. We provide legal and technical assistance to lawyers and human rights defenders. And I actually would like to echo on the previous comments about working in challenging closed countries like Turkmenistan, for example, where options of legal options are very, very limited. We have a case of human rights defenders from Turkmenistan, and there are no options on the table at all. He was working for the Cotton campaign, and actually your advice is to be creative is very helpful, because the team of his supporters also exploring options of what businesses are exist in Turkmenistan and what foreign businesses, whether it's H&M or IKEA, all options, but they're limited. we have another case from Russia of a gay man who is going to be deported to Uzbekistan, another very close country. And in that country, he most likely is going to be prosecuted. So I'm sure there are other cases of that type where there are, very, very limited options for those people. Are there foundations in Europe that are able to help on a sort of case-by-case basis?
Yes, I think, one second, I'm trying to, because that's a terrific question and terrific example that you raised about the case in Russia that you talk about. One second. So we have, you're talking about Ali Feruz, which is a terrific story. But we
Привет. Меня задержали и везут в отделение УВД по Басману.
Well, this is one of the terrific, sad but terrific examples of how intersectional and tight all the authoritarian regimes in the region are, and how predominantly Russian role in supporting those horrible human rights violations is. So tackling the Russian issue and involvement of Russian government with other authoritarian regimes, supporting and legitimize them, can lead us to fight off stories like that. And Ali right now is in prison, in deportation prison. His next court hearing is on September 10th. We all fight against the extradition because obviously it's a death sentence for him. It's another great story that of misconceptions about queer people running for lives from the region. Because one of the biggest problem when we did this video and tried to promote it to the foreign audience, the majority of questions came to me like, how it's possible that he had a wife and he's openly gay and something does not add up. So literally 90% of all messages I got, not how to help the case, but how it's like possible. And then it leads me to, and that's why I love all the time being in Sweden, because when I talk to allies, I don't have to explain that, because you deal with a lot of cases from Muslim countries where other European countries only start to dealing with them. I know that a lot of applications in by some European governments from Chechen men were refused just because they don't want to deal with Muslim men, because usually people who are running, gay people running from Muslim countries, take their families with them. They also have very often kids and wives, because this is extremely oppressed societies. But they also take all with them because if man runs, their family will be targeted. That's why European governments always freak out and say, like, we want to accept a gay man who files for asylum. We're not ready to accept their families. For those men who are running from places like Chechnya, Uzbekistan, there is no other option. They will never leave their families to die just so they have a life somewhere else. So these cases are extremely important to talk about. The case of Ali is extremely prolific in this way because it tells so many stories within cooperation between authoritarian regimes in the region, the predominant role of Russia supporting those regimes and legitimizing human rights abuses, including the issue of intertwined human rights and what Russia calls or Uzbekistan calls terrorist activities or Chechen government. And then the issue of that we don't understand much about human rights violations and lives of queer communities in developing countries. But we're about to deal a lot more with those issues in coming years. So we better learn and start asking questions now, even if they're naive. So we actually do not refuse asylum seekers like we do now from those countries.
Maxim,
Yeah.
thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
those very good answers to very difficult questions.
Thank you so much.
And I think that we all have learned quite a lot. You've painted a gloomy picture, really, of what's going on in Europe. But I'd like to come back to what you said when we started, that there is hope, that there is good things happening, though it's not a smooth ride, and it takes time.
And it is happening because of us working together.
That's right, and that was what I was going to conclude with. That
Sorry.
you also said that it's important that we in Sweden and in other European countries and rest of the world speak up and talk about, not necessarily using those acronyms, but talking about civil rights and talking about the freedom of expression, talking about, well, how a democracy and a just society should look like. And I can assure you that the Jarl Hjalmarson Foundation will continue to work together with you and with others, underlining all the time the importance of civil rights for good societies. So thank you very much once again, and good luck. And thank you for coming.
Thank you.